Ethan Cole stood in the shadows of the small-town cemetery, watching as the last few mourners left the gravesite. The woman in black remained, her face hidden by a veil, her shoulders sagging with grief. He knew her name. Emily Whitman, the widow of his former brother-in-arms, Daniel. He had promised to protect her, and yet here they were, Daniel dead, and Emily alone in her sorrow. Ethan had tried to stay away. After all, revenge wasn't supposed to be the answer. He'd left that life behind. But something in the broken way Emily stood there, refusing to leave her husband's grave, drew him in. He walked up slowly, each step deliberate, crunching against the gravel of the pathway. Emily glanced up, her eyes red and raw. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a hollow acknowledgement of Ethan's presence. "You came," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his face unreadable behind the scruff and dark shadows of the past few sleepless nights. "I promised Daniel I'd look after you." Emily scoffed, the sound bitter and empty. "Well, you did a great job, didn't you?" Her words were a knife to his gut, but Ethan couldn't blame her. He had failed. He had known Daniel was being targeted after leaving their unit. Some bad deal involving a crooked defense contractor and a piece of sensitive information they'd stumbled across in a desert half a world away. Ethan hadn't expected them to come after Daniel so soon, or so ruthlessly. "They won't get away with it, Emily," Ethan said softly, the hardness in his voice carrying the weight of a promise. She looked at him, something shifting in her eyes. "You know who did it, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer directly, but his silence spoke for him. Emily straightened, the veil slipping slightly to reveal the sharp determination beneath her grief. "Then take me with you," she said. Ethan blinked, genuinely surprised. "This isn't your fight. Daniel wouldn't have wanted." "Daniel is gone," she snapped, her voice cracking. "And all I have left is making sure the bastards who killed him pay. You owe him, Ethan. You owe me." Ethan paused, considering her. He saw more than just a widow's grief. He saw her need for justice, or perhaps just something to keep her from drowning in loss. Slowly he nodded. "All right," he said. "But you do exactly as I say." The trail led them to a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. Ethan had done his research. The men who killed Daniel were there, running a smuggling operation, confident that no one would dare come after them. They had no idea that a former Special Forces operative and a woman driven by fury were closing in. Emily followed Ethan silently as they crept through the darkened alleyways. Her heart pounded, and fear clung to her, but under it all was the icy resolve that had kept her going since Daniel's death. She was no longer the yoga instructor, the quiet wife who waited for her husband to come home. She had become someone else, someone who needed an end to the pain. Ethan signaled for her to stop, holding up his hand. 2 guards stood by the entrance, smoking and chatting. Ethan moved like a ghost, silent and swift, and within moments, the guards were on the ground, unconscious. He motioned Emily forward. They slipped into the warehouse, the air thick with the stench of oil and decay. Ethan led the way, his senses sharp, his body tense with the memory of countless missions like this. For Emily, every step felt like a descent into darkness, but she kept her eyes on Ethan's back, her grip tight on the small pistol he'd given her. They found him in an office at the back. Stephen Rourke, the man who had given the orders to kill Daniel. He was alone, leaning over a desk cluttered with maps and documents. Ethan stepped in first, his gun aimed steady at Rourke's head. "Don't move." Rourke looked up, his eyes widening, and then he laughed. A cold, derisive sound. "Cole, I knew you'd come eventually. Couldn't save your friend, though, could you?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Emily stepped out from behind him, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "No, but we're here to make sure you pay." Rourke's eyes flicked to her, confusion giving way to recognition, then amusement. "The widow," he sneered. "You really think you can?" The crack of the pistol cut him off. Emily's hand shook as the echoes of the shot filled the room, her fingers still on the trigger. She had aimed for his leg, just as Ethan had taught her. She wanted him to suffer first, to feel fear. Rourke fell back, clutching his wound, his face contorting in pain. Ethan looked at her, then nodded, his respect for her growing. He stepped forward, his voice calm and cold. That was for Daniel. Now you're going to tell us everything. Every name, every contact, every rotten deal you made. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Ethan and Emily walked out of the warehouse. Behind them, Rourke was bound, left for the authorities along with a neat package of evidence. Emily's face was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was a glimmer of something else. Closure, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. Ethan looked at her as they reached the car. "You did good in there," he said quietly. She nodded, her gaze distant. "It doesn't bring him back." "No," Ethan agreed. "But it's a start." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time the tears came. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried. He knew this was only the beginning of a long road, for both of them. Revenge had been the easy part. Now came the hard part. Finding a way to live again. And maybe, just maybe, they could do that together. The cold wind bit at Ethan's face as he drove, the steady hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. Emily sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hands still trembling slightly. She hadn't said a word since they left the warehouse. Ethan glanced at her, the lines of tension in her face unmistakable. "Emily," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We got him. It's over." She shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. "Not all of them, Ethan," she whispered. "You heard what he said. There are others who knew what was happening, who gave the orders. I can't let this go." Ethan clenched the steering wheel, the muscles in his arms tensing. He had hoped the confrontation with Rourke would end this nightmare, that Emily could find some semblance of peace. But he knew better. Revenge wasn't clean. It was a mess, a never-ending spiral that pulled you in deeper and deeper. He had seen it consume men before, and now he saw it in Emily. They arrived at Ethan's cabin, a small, secluded place deep in the woods. He parked the car, cutting the engine, and turned to her. "You're right," he said finally. "Rourke was just the start. But you need to know this isn't going to get easier. The men who did this, they're not like Rourke. They're powerful, protected. It'll get darker from here, Emily." She met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "I don't care. They took everything from me. I have nothing left to lose." Ethan stared at her for a long moment before nodding. He saw it now, the same cold determination that had driven him in his old life, before he had tried to walk away, before he thought he could live without violence. He pushed the cabin door open, gesturing for her to follow. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Ethan taught Emily everything she needed to know. How to move without being seen, how to break into places undetected, how to use different firearms. Each day was grueling, and Emily threw herself into it with a ferocity that left Ethan both impressed and worried. She was relentless, as if every bullet she fired, every door she picked was another piece of herself she was trying to reclaim. The lead they had gathered from Rourke pointed them toward a name, Vince Marlowe. He was a high-ranking executive at a supposedly legitimate security contractor, one that operated in the shadows, making deals with whoever paid the most regardless of legality. Marlowe had orchestrated Daniel's death, using him as leverage in a deal that had gone wrong. Ethan knew what had to be done, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Marlowe's men were professionals, former mercenaries, just like Ethan. They wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened them. One frigid December night, Ethan and Emily stood across the street from a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of the city, Marlowe's base of operations. Security was tight. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Cameras were stationed at every corner. It was a fortress. Ethan turned to Emily, his voice low and urgent. "You stay back. Do you hear me? This is different from Rourke. These men won't hesitate." Emily shook her head. "I'm not staying behind, Ethan. I'm going in there. We do this together." He saw the fire in her eyes, the determination that had brought her this far. He nodded finally. "All right, let's move." They approached silently, slipping through the trees that bordered the mansion's grounds. Ethan took out the first guard with practiced ease, a quick snap of his arm that sent the man crumpling to the ground. Emily followed his lead, her breath steady as they made their way through the shadows. It was almost surreal. Just a few months ago, she would have never imagined herself here, breaking into a fortified mansion, her hands slick with adrenaline. They made it to the back entrance, Ethan bypassing the security lock with a device he had rigged together from parts scavenged over the weeks. The door clicked open and they stepped inside. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by ornate chandeliers, the kind of place meant to make an impression. But beneath the luxury, there was a rot, a sense of corruption that ran deep. They moved through the corridors, Ethan leading the way, Emily close behind. They encountered another guard. This one saw them, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand reaching for his weapon. Emily acted before she could think, her pistol firing, the sound muffled by the silencer. The guard dropped, a red stain spreading across his chest. She stared at the body, her breath catching. Ethan turned, grabbing her arm, his voice sharp. "Focus, Emily. We're not done yet." She swallowed hard, nodding. The weight of what she had done pressed on her, but she pushed it aside. There was no turning back now. They reached Marlowe's office, the door slightly ajar. Ethan gestured for Emily to stay back, then pushed the door open, his gun raised. Marlowe was inside, seated at a massive mahogany desk, his expression one of mild surprise, as if he'd been expecting them. Well, Marlowe said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ethan Cole, I was wondering when you'd show up, and you brought company." Emily stepped forward, her face pale but her voice steady. "You killed my husband." Marlowe's eyes flicked to her, and he smiled. A cold, mocking smile. "Ah, the widow. I didn't think you had it in you, but here you are." Ethan moved closer, his gun aimed at Marlowe's head. "You're done, Marlowe. You're going to pay for what you did." Marlowe laughed, the sound echoing in the room. "Do you really think this changes anything, Cole? I'm just a piece of the puzzle. You kill me and another will take my place. You can't win this." Emily's hand tightened on her gun, her rage boiling over. "Then we'll keep going," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "One by one, until there's nothing left of you." Marlowe's smile faltered, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear in his eyes. He nodded to Emily, giving her the signal. She stepped forward, her gun steady, and fired. The shot echoed in the room, and Marlowe slumped back, the mocking smile wiped from his face forever. Ethan looked at Emily, her face a mix of emotions. Anger, grief, and a strange sense of relief. He walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's a start," she whispered, echoing his words from the cemetery. Ethan knew this wasn't the end. There were more men like Marlowe, more shadows that needed to be brought into the light. And as he looked at Emily, he realized they would face them together. They had nothing left to lose, and maybe that made them the most dangerous of all. The news of Vince Marlowe's death traveled faster than Ethan and Emily could have anticipated. In the underworld they had dared to enter, Marlowe was not just another crooked executive. He was a vital cog in a much larger machine. Ethan had suspected they would draw attention, but the speed and ferocity of the response surprised even him. He had thought they'd have more time to plan, to gather their strength. But instead, they found themselves hunted. They fled from town to town, constantly on the move, staying in dingy motels under false names. But the shadows seemed to follow them wherever they went. Emily's face was a mask of determination, but Ethan saw the cracks forming, the toll that this relentless life was taking on her. He knew he had to end this soon, one way or another. One night, they received a tip from an old contact of Ethan's, a man known only as Reyes. He had been a mercenary like Ethan once, but now operated on the fringes, trading in information. Reyes contacted them with an offer: the location of the head of the snake, the man behind Daniel's death, and all of the horrors they had faced. His name was Anton Volkov, a ruthless Russian kingpin who had orchestrated every piece of the conspiracy that had taken Daniel's life and destroyed Emily's world. "You end Volkov and it's over," Reyes had told them over a static-filled phone call. "But he's not going to go down easily, Cole. This isn't some two-bit thug. You're going after a man with an army." Ethan looked at Emily after the call ended, her face lit by the dim motel lamp, her eyes dark and unreadable. "This is it," he said, his voice soft. "If we do this, there's no going back." Emily's gaze was steady, her voice firm. "I never planned on going back, Ethan. This ends with him." The location Reyes had given them was an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of a crumbling city, a place where shadows thrived, and the law dared not enter. It was a fortress, with Volkov's men patrolling the perimeter, heavily armed and alert. Ethan and Emily watched from a distance, the tension between them almost palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of what they were about to do. A final gamble, a desperate move that could end in death for both of them. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes meeting Emily's. She nodded, her face pale but her eyes blazing with cold fury. They moved in silence, slipping through the gaps in the security, avoiding the guards with practiced precision. The adrenaline surged through Emily, each step bringing her closer to the man who had destroyed her life. She could feel the cold metal of the pistol in her hand, her finger brushing against the trigger, the weight of it grounding her, reminding her of her purpose. They entered the main building, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of grime that covered the floor. It was dark, the air thick with the scent of oil and rust, the walls lined with the decaying remnants of machinery. They could hear voices ahead, deep, guttural Russian, punctuated by harsh laughter. Volkov was here. Ethan led the way, his senses on high alert, every movement calculated and deliberate. They reached the door to Volkov's office, a heavy metal door with the sound of voices coming from behind it. Ethan turned to Emily, his expression grim. "Stay behind me. We do this clean." She nodded, her hand tightening around her gun. Ethan pushed the door open, and they entered. Volkov sat behind a massive desk, a cigar clamped between his teeth, his eyes narrowing as they entered. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked amused, as though he had been expecting them. Around him stood four heavily armed men, their guns raised, eyes locked on Ethan and Emily. Well, Volkov said, his voice thick with a Russian accent, his lips curling into a smile. "Ethan Cole and the grieving widow. You've come far, but this is where it ends." Ethan didn't hesitate. In a flash, he raised his gun, the first shot echoing through the room, striking one of the guards in the chest. Chaos erupted, gunfire filling the air, the acrid smell of gunpowder burning Emily's nostrils. She moved as Ethan had taught her, firing, ducking, using the cover of the massive desk as bullets splintered the wood around her. Ethan took down another guard, his movements precise, efficient. But there were too many, the room was too small, and the guards too well positioned. Emily saw Ethan falter, a bullet grazing his arm, the pain flashing across his face. Rage surged through her, and she moved without thinking, her gun aimed at Volkov. She fired, the shot hitting Volkov in the shoulder, the force knocking him back. His cigar fell from his mouth, his eyes widening in shock. She moved toward him, her heart pounding, her vision narrowing until all she could see was him, the man who had taken everything. Volkov tried to stand, blood pouring from the wound in his shoulder, but Emily was faster. She grabbed him, her fingers digging into his collar, her voice a low, furious hiss. "This is for Daniel," she said, her gun pressed to his chest. "Emily, no," Ethan shouted, but it was too late. She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the room, and Volkov slumped, his body falling limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The room fell silent, the last of the guards lying dead, the only sound the ragged breathing of Ethan and Emily. Ethan moved to her, his hand on her arm, pulling her back. "It's over, Emily," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's done." She looked at him, her eyes wide, her face pale. "Is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really over?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, feeling the tremors that racked her body. He knew the answer she sought, the peace she craved. But revenge had a way of hollowing you out, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. They left the complex as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the sky streaked with the pinks and oranges of a new day. They had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Volkov was dead, and with him, the men who had taken Daniel's life. But as they walked away, Ethan could see the weight that still hung over Emily. The questions that had no answers, the pain that no amount of vengeance could erase. They reached their car, and Ethan turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "What now?" he asked quietly. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her expression lost. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to live without this." Ethan nodded, understanding. He had been there once, lost in the darkness with nothing to guide him. But as he looked at her, he saw something else too: strength, resilience, a spark that had not been extinguished. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Then we find a way," he said softly. "Together." Emily looked at him, her lips trembling, and she nodded. Maybe it wasn't over, not really. The ghosts of their past would always haunt them, the scars of what they had done forever a part of them. But they were alive, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As they drove away, leaving behind the blood and the darkness, Ethan felt a strange sense of hope, a flicker of light in the vast, consuming night. They had survived, and perhaps that was the first step toward something more. Toward redemption, toward peace, toward a life that was no longer defined by revenge. And as the road stretched out before them, Ethan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.